Okay, today we are writing our notes on DNA structure and replication. So the title of your notes are DNA structure, that means what it's made out of, and replication. You should remember that that is kind of like the word duplication, meaning it's making a copy of itself. So remember, we are going to use Cornell style. So we're going to just emphasize this line going down, if you have one in your notebooks, for questions, sample test questions. And we're going to draw a line at the very bottom for us to write our conclusion. Okay? So let's begin. This is going to be all about the DNA and how it copies itself. So we better start with the definition of DNA. What is DNA? Well, you sound really smart when you say it. DNA is deoxyribose nucleic acid. That's where we get the D and the N and the A. Okay? So what exactly is that? Well, that is genetic material that carries information about an organism from one generation to the next. How is it that you look like your mom or your dad or your grandpa? That's DNA, passed from one generation to the next. Okay, so let's talk more specifically. Where is DNA found? DNA is found in the chromatin in the nucleus. Now, you'll remember from our last unit on mitosis, it's not always neatly coiled up like an X, and then we call it a chromosome. Sometimes it's just this messy fibers all globbed up in there. Okay, but it will always be in the nucleus. Your DNA is always in the nucleus. Depending on where it is in the cell cycle, sometimes you'll see it like those X's in chromosome, and sometimes it'll just be a tangled mess in there. Okay? Either way, it's still DNA, and that rhymes. All right. So DNA molecule, it's a huge molecule. If you'll remember, it's one of the 4 biomolecules we learned about in the beginning of the year. It was the one that we called a nucleotide, right? So it's a big, long molecule, which we also called a polymer, and it looks like a twisted ladder. I'm sure you've seen it. When people want to say they're smart and they're scientists, they either show a Erlenmeyer flask with bubbles coming out, or they show a DNA molecule that looks like a twisted ladder. We're going to draw it in a minute, and we're going to do a foldable after this, so you'll be real familiar with it. And we call that a double helix. You may get that on a test question. It's called a double helix. I'm going to add some color here in a minute, all right? So, it is made up of units. Remember, we call those units a monomer. Remember that? Monomer and polymer. So they're made up of a monomer, the unit. If you remember, we called it nucleotide. I'm going to say units called nucleotides. So this is a review, and the next thing I'm going to do is show you what is a nucleotide, okay? So what is a nucleotide? You should have that on your word wall. And if you remember, there's 3 parts to it. You have a 5-carbon sugar, That's the deoxyribose here. This is the sugar. Okay. You have a phosphate group. We usually just show that as a P. I'll show you that in a second. And we have a nitrogen base. There's those 3 repeating units that just go over and over and over again. So now I'm going to stop and add some color all the way in these notes. Whenever I have a sugar, I'm going to make it red. So you might want to color code it. The D for DNA stands for deoxyribose. That's the sugar. Okay. And the phosphate isn't in that name. So, but anyway, phosphate I'm going to always have as a P, and then I'm always going to show the nitrogen base as green, okay? And that mainly is for down here. But just remember, deoxyribose means sugar, okay? All right, so what does that nucleotide look like? Well, it's really cool, and you should be familiar with it now. The phosphate and the carbon make like the rungs of a ladder. If you can picture a ladder like this, and you know you climb up the ladder and you walk on these rungs, the rungs are the nitrogen bases, and the 2 uprights are like the ladder, okay? The rungs of the ladder. So I'm going to draw it. I'm going to start with the phosphorus. I'm going to have 2 here like this, and I'm going to have 2 here like this. They make the rungs of the ladder. So do the 5. I'm going to draw a pentagon because the sugar is like a pentagon. I'm going to make these bonds a different color. Okay. So it's just a nice little relationship here where the sugar and the phosphate make the sides of the ladder. Sometimes they call it the rungs of a ladder. And this is just going to keep on going like that. And then what are you going to step on? Well, you're going to step on the nitrogen bases. And I messed up my color. Okay, so the sugar we're going to make red. I hope you caught that and said, Miss Bashan, what are you doing? Okay, now the bases are the rungs, and I did this in green. These are the ones that have to fit together, and there's 4 of them. And I'm going to go into them in further detail just in a second here. But there are these 4. There's adenine, and there's thymine. These 2 go together, and there's guanine, and there's cytosine, and these 2 go together. Cytosine. Okay? So these always are in pairs, and the way I remember it is that at is a word in English, and that's the only word that these can make if you just use the first initial. So if I always remember at, then if I see a C or a G, then I know those 2 go together. Okay? So we like to draw them in like their shapes, okay? So I'm going to make this like a piece of a puzzle, and I'm just going to label that A, and the only one that will fit that piece of the puzzle is thymine, and that makes that side of the ladder, okay? And on this one, I'm going to make this a C, and that's going to be shaped like that, and the only one that fits that is G, and that's that side of the ladder. So there's a close-up of your ladder, okay, that makes your DNA. All right. And so we want to remember that these 2 always go together, and these 2 go together. Okay. All right. So now a few more notes. During DNA replication, So we're moving on to something else. So here's how the DNA looks. But remember from our last unit, for mitosis, the DNA has to replicate. It has to make a copy of itself so that the exact same amount of DNA can go in each daughter cell. Well, this is how it does it. It's really cool. Just always think of a zipper, okay? So during DNA replication, a DNA molecule unzips. It unzips itself between the paired bases. Okay? So it's going to unzip in between the A's and the T's and in between the G's and the C's. And remember, the A stands for adenine, C stands for cytosine, T stands for thymine, and G stands for guanine. Okay? So the paired, between its paired bases. New bases pair up with the bases of the old strand forming two identical DNA strands. So this is like a close-up of mitosis. This is how it works. Okay, now I'm not a very good drawer, but I'm going to try. Okay, so we have our original strand like this. Okay, and let's say these are the different bases. And they're paired up. Now all of a sudden it unzips. So it goes and it unzips up here, and this one unzips down here. And what that allows is a new strand to form for this guy and a new strand to form for this guy. Now I decided to use green for all my bases just so you got the 3 of the nucleotide ready, but later on in other things we'll use a different color for each base. But this is just to show you how it starts out as one strand, it unzips, new bases fill in to pair up, and you have 2 strands. And that is how DNA replicates. And there you go. That is DNA structure and replication.